In ancient times, the 7 deadly sins, a group of the most abhorrent traits humanity can possess, were used to justify severe actions like capital punishment. It makes sense why religions that preach purity would want to purge their societies of sin, but in the world of Berserk, things seem to be headed in the opposite direction. Most people don't realize, but they're living in a world created from the evil energies of the abyss, and the reason sin is so abhorred is because it's seen as a manifestation of evil. And yet, somehow, much of the human population has put their full weight behind a man who pretty much embodies all 7 sins, and that man is Griffith. The Falcon of Light is currently posing as the Jesus Christ of the Berserkverse, but in truth, he's a sinful fallen Seraph, and in this video, we'll be taking a look at every action Griffith takes that corresponds with those sins. So, without further ado, let's get straight into it. These are the 7 deadly sins of Griffith explained. Pride. As you go through this video, you'll realize that a lot of Griffith's sins aren't exactly clear-cut. They don't fall into a single category, and often there's an overlap between several of the other sins. So what we're going to do here is isolate some of the biggest examples of each sin that he's displayed in the past, and we're going to connect them with the other sins as and when they do fit. But starting this list off with pride feels like an almost no-brainer, because one of the main reasons people absolutely hate Griffith, especially the nobility, is his immense pride. That nobility basically has a PhD in pride, so they know when they're around prideful people, and pride basically forms the foundation of Griffith's identity. He's a common man who's aspiring to become king of all humans. In part, his motivation is the simple belief that he's just better than every existing current ruler. We see a glimpse of the true extent of Griffith's pride in one of the few chapters where we do get his point of view. It's during his imprisonment at the Tower of Rebirth, where he reflects on all the events that led him to that cold and dark place. Griffith thinks to himself that he's always had a certain effect on the people he meets, which can either develop into animosity and hatred or loyalty and love. He says that he has had everyone in his hands through this effect since day one, and the fact that Guts was able to get a bigger hold on him than he had on himself was one of the key factors that led to Griffith's downfall. And speaking of Guts, you can see the pride in Griffith on full display morning after the former's first deployment as a Falcon. After he declares his intent to become king one day, Griffith boldly declares that Guts is his now, and that he will decide the place that Guts will die. This, of course, is foreshadowing for Griffith eventually becoming a divine figure with command over human fate itself, but in the moment, it also reveals Griffith's pride. He doesn't think that he and Guts are equals, thinks of Guts as his property, and in fact, Griffith never considers his soldiers to be his friends. In fact, he says that only a person with an equal desire to keep pursuing their own dreams was qualified to be called Griffith's friend, and that reveals just how high of an opinion he has of himself. A certain amount of pride is good, because without it, men would forget how to move their limbs, but Griffith is often associated with vanity in the way that he thinks and moves, and that's a form of pride that creates tragic figures like Narcissus. The White Falcon's confidence in his moves is justified. Griffith is clearly one of the most intelligent and gifted battle commanders of his generation. He managed to remain undefeated as a mercenary leader, growing his band from a few dozen men to a veritable army of 5,000 trained, equipped, and grizzled soldiers. He often comes up with strategies that seem insane on paper but work out perfectly in his favor when they're put into action. Griffith's military career was enough to earn him the rank of a general in the Kingdom of Midland, which was an achievement unheard of for a commoner until he accomplished it. But because his sights were set on the throne, he kept pursuing higher power at the cost of, well, anything, and perhaps the greatest example of his pride comes from his downfall. When Griffith is defeated by Guts that fateful morning in the snow, his loss can be attributed to not just his softening skills, but also his prideful state of mind. Throughout the entire duel, right up until it ended, Griffith believed that he could defeat Guts. Not only that, he thought he could counter Guts' first move without hesitation and was actually worried that he might kill the man accidentally because he believed in his own skill to an almost delusional level. Griffith did acknowledge that Guts was probably stronger than him for a moment, but he brushed that thought aside because his pride told him Guts' departure was an unacceptable affront to his authority. When that pride was shattered in a single stroke, along with Griffith's sword, he gave up even trying to hide his true intentions from people. He seduced Princess Charlotte the same night Guts left, and when he was caught and imprisoned by the King of Midland, Griffith used his wits to antagonize the king instead of negotiating his way out of a prison cell. He could have maneuvered the king into keeping him at his post because of the massive amount of goodwill he'd generated with the public, and hell, maybe he could have even married Charlotte a few years after he was released, because that's the level of connivance we can expect from Griffith. But instead, he chooses his pride and insults the king, calling his reign mediocre at best and exposing his attraction to his own daughter as well. Griffith's pride becomes his undoing when the king decides to have him tortured for a full year, and to be completely honest to the king here, he was in the right for once. Seducing and sleeping with the princess was a treasonous crime, and it warranted the worst kind of punishment available. Griffith overreached his station and was burned by the star of his own ambition, and yet he refused to let go of his pride even after it became clear that he could no longer function as a ruler. The year-long torture leaves Griffith a mute invalid, and yet he keeps dreaming about that castle from his childhood, which stands as a symbol of his hubris. He's willing to sacrifice whatever he needs to sacrifice to fulfill his dream, and that's exactly what he does during the eclipse. Ironically enough, Griffith's pride becomes naked and apparent after he becomes a God Hand member, because his first canonical meeting with Guts sees him calling this human a worm squirming under the weight of his pathetic existence. Femto is basically Griffith unleashed, and as a member of the deific order of the God Hand, he no longer has to mask his pride to further his ambitions. He knows that he'll become king because he now possesses prophetic insight. That's the ultimate kind of sinful pride. Being proud of yourself is different from having pride in all that you do. Even religious people dislike those who claim to have sole ownership of God because they adhere to tradition like others. Serving God should be a humble endeavor, duty that's as much a part of one's daily life as eating or breathing, and so turning it into a popularity contest or proof of one's piety is among the most disgusting things a person can do. And yet, now that he's a literal God Hand, Griffith doesn't have to worry about being smote by God's hand. In fact, his pride is now reshaping the landscape of the Berserk verse, because despite having divine power, he's still intent on becoming king of the world. Pride is considered the original sin precisely because it shows the arrogance of those who would dare to question God, and Griffith's gone way beyond just questioning God. He's currently posing as the son of God, in a sense, and that all started with his prideful decision of claiming a crown, no matter the price. Speaking of prices, greed. Greed is a difficult one to quantify because Griffith doesn't have the kind of greed we think of when we first hear the word. He isn't hungry for riches and land, and he doesn't exactly act like a pauper with his men either. In fact, Griffith is quite a generous mercenary leader because to him, currency is just another tool to achieve the ultimate object of his greed, a throne. Griffith's greed for the throne is so palpable that the nobles that surround him throughout the Golden Age arc can practically smell it on him. Yes, it's true that the nobility of Berserk generally falls into the selfish save-your-own-skin type, but conspiracy theories don't remain conspiracy theories if they have some truth to them, and the fact that Griffith was trying to pull off something shady with his rapid ascension is apparent to everyone in the court of Midland. So great was Griffith's desire for the throne that he allowed himself to be used as a pleasure toy by a disgusting man called Genin, who also happened to be a governor for the Tudor Empire. In Griffith's mind, Genin's money was his fastest path to kingship. He flat out admits to Casca that he had no problem selling his own body like a common whore because it was all for the cause of his dream, which we know by now is an elaborate metaphor for world conquest. And there are moments when Griffith's greed slips out in the story, so you have to be hawk-eyed to spot them. On at least 3 occasions, Griffith snaps into what we call his real self during the Golden Age, and it's in those moments that Miura depicts him as a hawk-like predator. The first comes from the moment he figures out that Count General Julius attempted to take his life because it takes a greedy man to recognize another. Julius was the younger brother of the king and, more importantly, his designated heir. The king of Midland only had a daughter, and it was assumed that Julius's son Adonis would marry his cousin to strengthen their family line. Julius marked Griffith as an enemy early on because he knew that the Falcon was going to use his growing military presence as leverage for something, so he wanted to take Griffith out immediately. Sadly, Julius was as incompetent as he was haughty, which ultimately led to Griffith figuring out his plots quite easily. The second moment was when he sent Guts on a mission to assassinate Julius and found out that he'd scored his son's life as well. Griffith was with the princess at a formal ball when this news was delivered to them. Although Charlotte was devastated by the death of her kin, Griffith had this sly smile on his face that reflected something akin to pleasure. He was showing his greed for the throne in that moment because with Julius and Adonis's death, Charlotte was now the undisputed heiress to Midland's throne, and Griffith's path was becoming clearer by the night. The third time he hits us with that icy see Falcon stare is when he figures out that he still has enemies within the system, which happens when he briefly exchanges words with Minister Foss. Griffith claims that he knew the scent of fear too well, that Foss's own fear of being discovered as Julius's accomplice was what gave him away. But Griffith knows greed just as well. And say whatever you will about the man, but Minister Foss's greed with regards to the preservation of the nobility's structure was plain for all to see. And at the end of the day, the fact that Griffith even targets Midland as the kingdom whose royal line he wants to take over is evident of his greed, because as a student of history, he was surely aware of the kingdom's legendary ruler, the first and only emperor of mankind, Supreme King Geiserik. After he erects his own capital city of Falconia, Griffith flat out says that he wants to create a second empire that outshines Geiserik's, and though his counselors perceive this as the vision of a visionary, we the readers know that this is his greed for the throne playing out just as he wants it to. Hell, the eclipse is perhaps the biggest symbol of Griffith's greed because he knowingly sacrifices his own men for the sake of power. The fallen falcon doesn't do a lot of talking after he has his tongue removed from his mouth, his eyes speak for him, and he's visibly terrified of the God Hand at first. But as they engage in their routine of coaxing people into accepting their deal, Griffith's fear turns into resolve in the worst way imaginable. He becomes convinced that he's always been a murdering bastard, and so the lives of the very comrades who brought him all this way means nothing to him anymore, especially if it means that he can do everything they did all by himself. It's his obsession with the word power that leads to everything bad that happens in Berserk. And if that doesn't sound like greed to you guys, then maybe you haven't wanted something bad enough to commit war crimes for it. Griffith most certainly has, and there's more than enough evidence for it which we've laid out for you. And speaking of greed for power and absolute control, that sort of bleeds into the next header on this list because envy. Wanting something that someone else has is considered to be quite a normal thing these days, because humans have moved quite far from biblical morality in the modern age. But back when things were a lot more religious, shall we say, any person who openly coveted what someone else had was seen as a sinner, for they were committing the grave sin of envy. Envy is the emotion you feel when you see someone else rocking those sneakers you've always wanted or going on that trip you know you can't afford. To put it simply, envy is the emotion that's born when one is unable to accept their circumstances in life, the point that they openly antagonize those who have what they don't. And if you look at the story of Berserk from this particularly green lens, then you'll realize that, in a way, all of Griffith's life decisions stem from his envious desire to join the ranks of those who have power in this world. He wanted to become a king because he was always envious of the safety and warmth that the castle from his birth city represented in his mind. Though you wouldn't guess just by looking at him, Griffith was born a poor orphan and he spent several cold nights sleeping on the streets and behaving like an urchin. That envy turned into purpose, and for a time, it really looked like Griffith wanted to become king for the sake of revolution instead of personal desire. When Casca first meets him, he makes the grand declaration that just because someone is born a noble doesn't give them the right to prey upon all others. And it's true that Griffith is more magnanimous than most nobles of his day, but his envy comes to the forefront whenever we see him discussing his dreams earnestly or when we observe his reaction to losing something. In those rare moments where he drops the veneer of being this great military genius, Griffith's words reveal the envy he harbors in his heart against the people of nobility. He says that he used Genin to his advantage by taking advantage of Genin's appetites. It's clear from his speech that he hates himself for stooping so low just to make a quick buck. Griffith dresses it up as a noble sacrifice at the altar of his dream. The fact that he claws into his own flesh and repeatedly tries to convince Casca that he feels unclean tells us that he isn't just sad about having to sleep with Genin. In the very first canon appearance of his character, Griffith tells Guts his personal philosophy on life, and that regardless of one's birth, there exist people in this world that can make it turn on its axis because they are the true golden elite. He wants to find a place for himself among them, because he's seen how life is like for everyone else and he doesn't much care for it. You can feel the frustration Griffith exudes when he talks to Casca about Genin, because he's not tearing his flesh open just because he had to sleep with a dirty old geezer. He's doing it because he wasn't born with power, and that this is the kind of thing nobles like Genin would never have to do to achieve their goals. Griffith's envy becomes obvious when he's rescued from the Tower of Rebirth, because instead of focusing on the fact that he was alive, he chooses to become hyper-fixated on the budding romance between Guts and Casca. By this point in the manga, Griffith had established Guts as the reason behind everything going wrong in his life, simply because he refuse to take accountability for his own actions. When he first sees Guts in the Tower of Rebirth, he has a look in his eye that reflects another sin which we'll get to a bit later on in this video. But after watching his former comrade shed tears over his broken body, Griffith's expression becomes a bit softer. It's a tender moment that shows that even though he's willing to hate this man with every fiber of his being, somewhere deep down, he's still happy Guts came for him. But all of that lasts for just a few seconds, because next, Griffith watches Guts clean house. He stares at him as he clears out over 200 soldiers from the Tower of Rebirth, and the anger in his eyes becomes quite clear to perceive by the time the rescue team reaches their exit point. Griffith absolutely hates the fact that he's no longer capable of defending himself, and that the man who is doing it for him is the very man he blames for his situation. Moreover, can't believe just how powerful Guts has become in their time apart, because now he's truly a one-man army unto himself. Griffith's envy keeps growing as he watches Guts battle an apostle by himself and win, because that's something they couldn't do even as a team. And most of all, he absolutely abhors the way Casca treats him now, because that's how she used to treat Griffith. She would fawn over every single thing Griffith did and would have died for him if he commanded her to, but now her first instinct was to check on whether Guts was holding up all right instead of rushing over to her personal god. Griffith might have lost his tongue, but he hadn't lost the power of observation. Miura only gives us close-ups of his eyes and actually gives us his literal viewpoint on a few occasions between the rescue attempt and the eclipse, and it's clear from those that Griffith thinks Guts stole everything from him. His dream, his strength, and now even his girl. Whatever political game he was playing with Princess Charlotte didn't change the fact that he knew Casca was in love with him, and though we don't know if he loved her back, we do know that he absolutely loved the attention that came with it. The moment that attention was gone, Griffith started burning with the green flames of envy as he watched Guts and Casca become closer than he ever got to either one of them, which in part motivates him to trigger the eclipse. It also leads him to commit one of his worst acts as a human being, yes, something borderline worse than the eclipse. For now, let's refocus. Griffith's envious nature is at its peak when something he considers to be quote-unquote his is taken away from him, and that applies to his strength, his women, and most importantly, his dream. He won't just be jealous of you, he'll become so vindictive that you'll wish you never met him. That's why we say his envy caused the eclipse in a way. He simply couldn't stomach the fact that someone he was supposed to own now owned everything that was once his, and it led him to push the entire world into darkness. Now that we've addressed Griffith's envy, let's move on to a sin that might not be applicable to him in the traditional sense, but it's applicable to him in just about every other sense. Lust. This one's a bit harder to quantify than the others because Griffith isn't lustful in the traditional sense of the word. He isn't a lecherous dweeb who goes around frothing at the mouth whenever he sees a passably pretty wench or dame, but he does lust for power, and he's not at all above using others' lust for him to his own advantage. We believe that our exploration of Griffith's pride, greed, and envy sufficiently covers his lust for power, so let's take a look at how he uses the lust of others to his own advantage. The main victims of Griffith's sex games are Governor Genin and Princess Charlotte. What's interesting about them is that they both might be on the opposite ends of the spectrum of morality, but they both react to Griffith in the same way, with an intense sense of longing. Griffith's tryst with Genin occurred several years before the main timeline of Berserk, and it lasted for just a night, but whatever Griffith did to him must have been intense because several years later, Genin still lusts for him and actually thinks that Griffith loves him. The White Falcon is a great beauty by all standards, but Genin's obsession with him goes beyond appearances. He clearly longs for an experience that surpasses his last encounter with Griffith, which means that Griffith completely toyed with his mind just to get that bag. We later see a similar thing with Princess Charlotte, who's attracted to Griffith but completely unsure about what she should do with her feelings as a princess of the realm. Charlotte gives Griffith all the romantic keepsakes she has in store and waits on him like a wife would on a husband who's gone to war. When Griffith enters her bedchambers that fateful night, she's actually shocked by the moves he puts on her. She starts resisting and pulling away from him because although she wants him, she knows that what he's forcing on her is also wrong. But Griffith just calls out her fear and asks her to cast it into the flames. Charlotte, being the smitten noblewoman she is, promptly does. We know that Griffith doesn't particularly like Charlotte because she never figures into his thoughts even when he's having sex with her. That whole dynamic is based on his lust for the power her title holds and him not being able to accept the fact that Guts left him. In fact, he thinks a lot more about Guts than Charlotte while he's with Charlotte, which has led to many fans speculating that perhaps Griffith lusts for him as well, but Genin Damon and Charlotte are part of a larger pattern where Griffith exploits his sexually attractive appearance to gain allies that are important for the achievement of his dream. Later on in the series, he meets this girl named Sonia who has heightened oracular powers and can see astral developments despite being in the physical world. Griffith clearly knows that Sonia lusts for him and that to become king, he needs to marry Charlotte. He must be aware of how such a situation could become explosive if left unchecked, and yet he leaves it unchecked because he needs Sonia's power for his goals. If that means keeping her enchanted with his looks, so be it. And Sonia is just one of many a woman who has admired Griffith's good looks in the series. But perhaps the best example of Griffith's lust comes from that crime we mentioned a few minutes ago, which is, to us, even more monstrous than the eclipse and quite possibly his worst act as a human being. We're talking about the moment he forces himself on Casca. This happens a couple of chapters before the eclipse and can be seen as an act that's the amalgamation of all 4 sins we've covered so far. Casca was the one person whose story made Griffith a hero in our eyes. We don't get to see how any of the other Falcons joined the band except her, and in her story, Griffith is her savior, who protects her honor from being defiled and checks the nobility for their own pride, greed, envy, and lust. But there were hints throughout the story that Griffith wasn't necessarily as noble as he made himself seem that day, with the biggest one being that the original band of the Falcon were more like the bandits of the Falcon. Griffith allows Corcus, thief with a group of 10 men under him, to join up with him and become a leader in his supposed-to-be royal army. And Judo's first instinct after rescuing Griffith is to become a bandit again, most likely a return to the roots kind of situation. In fact, even in Casca's origin story, we see that Griffith saving her was a chance encounter because really, the Falcons were targeting that noble's carriage for a raid. So, her worshipping him is completely based on that one moment where he saved her from getting assaulted and nothing else. Life debts can be quite tricky because when you owe your life to someone, you kind of tend to ignore their truth because of your perceived debt. And it looks like that's exactly what happens to Casca because she ignores all the red flags, continues loving Griffith despite acknowledging how impossible it would be. Even after she hooks up with Guts, she still keeps Griffith in her mind and feels jealous of Princess Charlotte because she can't forget her debt to him. And the moment Griffith tries to take advantage of that trust by forcing himself on her, despite no longer being a functioning human being, it violates every metric of trust there is in the world. Miura clearly depicts Griffith thrusting his pelvis towards Casca's in that chapter, so we don't think there's any confusion on our part. And then, of course, he has him have his way with her during the eclipse, which is a culmination of several ugly emotions being released at once. When Griffith assaults Casca, he doesn't just do it out of lust, he does it to establish dominance over Guts and her both, because by doing this, he now owns their souls regardless of whether they end up in the abyss. So yeah, Griffith isn't exactly Wild the Apostle when it comes to the topic of lust, but in some ways he's even worse. He keeps his lust bottled up to the point that it comes out at the worst time possible. And considering he's connected to fate itself, that has implications not just for the people around him, the world as well. This rather neatly brings us to the next sin of Griffith, which is gluttony. Gluttony is something that can never be attributed to Griffith in the conventional sense of the word. This sin was thought of as a critique of the kind of overindulgence that can strain the lives of regular people. If you check the descriptions of the sin of gluttony anywhere in the world, it will refer to the overconsumption of food and drink and regard corpulent men as sinners because they feast at the expense of starving the poor. It's the one sin that most people seem to get away with because there's been so many gluttonous kings throughout history. Griffith clearly isn't one of them because whenever we see him eating, he's having modest food and he only dines lavishly in the presence of nobility. However, that depends on your definition of food because if it's bread and wine, then it's true that Griffith isn't gluttonous. But if we're talking blood and souls, then that assumption couldn't be any farther from the truth than the Griffith did nothing wrong folks are. To a human being, grain and salt and water are the foundations for nourishment. But to a demon, that food comes from devouring human flesh and with it their souls. It's implied several times in Berserk that the power of evil is directly proportionate to the number of sacrifices a person makes. Grunbeld made 3 sacrifices when he became an apostle, which is why he has one of the strongest apostle forms ever. But for God Hand members, that number needs to be in the hundreds, if not thousands. That's certainly the case for Griffith as well. He might not have consumed the souls of an entire city full of people like Void did. He did sacrifice 500 men at the altar of his own ambition and felt their dying souls piercing through him as he came face to face with his new god. Griffith's current power as Femto is drawing directly from the souls of the comrades he sacrificed, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is nourishment. His new food source is dead souls, and from that perspective, Griffith is a massive glutton. The eclipse isn't even his worst act of gluttony when you consider the idea that human flesh and souls are his new food source. That would be the incarnation ceremony at the Tower of Conviction, where Griffith consumes the souls of thousands of people to regain a body of flesh. The incarnation ceremony used the entire city of St. Albion as its feeding grounds, and there were definitely a lot more than 500 people in those refugee camps outside the tower walls. And once he regained said body of flesh, Griffith turned every battlefield into a feeding operation, which means he's added thousands of people to his own power source since then. We say this because the story also leads us to believe that after people are killed in his service, Griffith lets their souls bid farewell to their loved ones because he sends said souls to the vortex, which also happens to power him. He tells Mule Wolfflame that the souls go to a place where they can be won, and given that he's a God Hand member, that place could only be the vortex of souls. So gluttony isn't a sin Griffith commits in the traditional sense, but when you consider that his definition of food is basically people, you realize he's just as gluttonous as the cheesemongers and slavers from George R.R. Martin's stories. In fact, we see the effects of his soul-reaping enterprise in his actions as the Falcon of Light and the new leader of the Western world, which, you guessed it, relates to his next sin, sloth. Sloth is a weird sin to quantify because for the most part, it refers to laziness and disinterest in the pursuit of holiness or just life in general. Sloth can be summed up with the word inaction, but there are several contexts for said inaction, which is where the complications arise. By some accounts, this equates to ignoring the 7 gifts of grace given by the Holy Ghost, which are knowledge, wisdom, understanding, counsel, piety, fortitude, and fear of the Lord. In other accounts, it's described as being the sorrow about spiritual good, where the facetiousness of the mind which neglects being good is called evil instead, if it so oppresses men as to draw them away entirely from good deeds. Dante's Inferno calls sloth the result of an insufficient amount of personal love for one's own life, and apathy, rancor, boredom, laziness, indolence, and idleness in the face of a great need are all perceived as being part of this thing called sloth. It basically talks about self-isolation in a way because it talks about how delaying committing good deeds in favor of one's own pride is sinful. Sloth can be attributed to those heartless, cold politicians who delay sending aid to a place despite it needing that aid just to preserve their own status quo. It's the disconnection of the human heart from decision-making, because making you a good person at heart is the stated goal of religion. Chaucer believed that not performing good deeds just because the world around you wasn't fair or nice was a sign of sloth, and there are many historical quotes that go something along the lines of, "In times of moral crisis, the man who takes no action is worse than either side of the crisis." Based on this understanding of sloth, we can safely say that Griffith choosing to expand the borders of Falconia and actually being a godless charlatan as the physical and astral worlds collide is definitely the biggest example of this from the series. In truth, all of Griffith's actions are in service of his own ambition when he could have used his ideas to revolutionize the world. We can't deny that Griffith wasn't a dreamer and a go-getter. His entire military career's success was based around his ingenious planning skills and his determination to see things through, no matter how ugly they got. Hell, when Griffith starts rattling off the reforms he wants to bring to Falconia in chapter 358, he talks about feeding refugees into the army, about establishing schools for public education, about ramping up guild investments to boost production, and creating castles all around Falconia at important passages to keep expanding the walls of their kingdom forever. Griffith basically lays down his vision for a unified mankind under Falconia's authority. We can't deny that some of his ideas were truly revolutionary and progressive, but the fact of the matter is that all of this is coming way too late. Had Griffith made these suggestions after becoming king as a human being, his name would have been etched into history as one of the greatest rulers in humanity's history. Alas, they came after he already possessed the power to change the world on a fundamental level, and is in fact holding back at all times because giving away too much about his real identity as an angel demon would ruin the whole game. Salat says it best when he explains the Kushan Empire's decision to take the fight to Falconia in chapter 326. Salat tells a protesting Rickert that they have a chance of winning against Griffith because, unlike him, Kushan Empire's intentions weren't evil. After hearing Rickert's story about what led to the current circumstances of the world, Salat and Daiba came to realize that Griffith was actually a god on earth in essence. He could remove all the injustice from the world if he wanted to, yet he chose to keep conquering as a human king instead of changing the world for the better. That's the clearest example of Griffith committing the sin of sloth in this series that we can find for you guys, because it is true that he's only doing what he's doing for himself. In fact, Griffith's heart and human emotions emotions have literally been frozen, and he no longer feels things like love or hate or rage. He only focuses on his dream, which is to become king of the world. He doesn't care how many lies he has to tell in the process, or about the fact that he's basically desecrating the name of God. Griffith knows damn well that he's the Falcon of Darkness, the Antichrist figure that the Holy See scriptures preach against, and yet he uses the sea to pose as the Falcon of Light, or the Jesus of the Berserkverse. All the while, he perverts the faith by sending the souls of its faithful to the vortex, which is another example of Griffith's slothful nature. He could, in theory, simply release those souls and let them go wherever they would end up based on their karma, but he's deliberately sending them all to hell, presumably to boost his own power and grasp over the world. All of his subjects know that he's got miraculous abilities that allow him to control monsters and defeat them as well, but none of them know that they live in this nightmare world because of Griffith, which makes it even worse that they truly believe in him. Griffith's slothful nature makes him choosing to establish an empire even when two separate planes of existence are colliding with another shows just how indifferent he's become. That brings us to the final sin on this list, which is wrath. Griffith's wrath is something we don't really get to see in its full glory ever, really, but we do get glimpses of it early on in the story, and we suspect we'll see it again right before the story ends. So to understand Griffith's moments of wrath, we need to first understand what wrath means exactly. Wrath is considered to be a rather pointed form of anger, which one person holds a hateful grudge for another to the point of wanting to kill them or cause generational harm to them. To put it simply, wrath is the willingness to act upon the desire for revenge. It's often directed towards a person that's innocent. In many ways, Guts is a wrathful character because his sole purpose in life is revenge. He fights and kills apostles by the score, not because he's trying to cleanse the world of evil, but because he wants to track and kill Griffith. Guts blames Griffith for everything that's wrong in his life, and for a while, he was even considered to be the Falcon of Darkness because of the massive trail of destruction he left in his wake. But the thing is, Guts' wrath is more than justified. He's pissed off because Griffith killed their friends for the sake of demonic power, and for assaulting his girl in front of him and turning his baby into a demon. Guts has plenty of reasons to be angry with Griffith, though the violence he commits at times isn't justified. For the most part, Guts tries his best to do the right thing. His anger is directed towards a true act of injustice. He's trying to avenge a rather bloody memory that stains the fabric of space and time itself. On the other hand, Griffith convinces himself that Guts is the cause for all his life problems during his imprisonment, which is the kind of wrath that attunes with his sinful behavior. In Chapter 49, we get to see Griffith following a full year of imprisonment and torture. It's clear that he's lost his mind. He keeps thinking to himself about the dream he's lost, and he blames both that loss and his own survival on Guts, whom he calls his sole sustenance. Griffith has a bunch of mixed feelings towards Guts, but the clearest one is his irrational anger because he blames Guts for things that aren't Guts' fault. He blames Guts for his imprisonment, which was Griffith's mistake because he couldn't stomach the news of Guts' departure. He blames Guts for his torture and the loss of his dream, and the truth is that Griffith did both of those things with his own hands. Griffith's wrath for Guts is so great that it leads to his first informal meeting with the God Hand, and when he sees Guts of all people breaking him out of his cell, his first instinct is to try and kill him. Griffith makes another attempt on his life with the eclipse, which he triggers because he's both afraid and angry at the kind of influence Guts has over him. It's that feeling of helplessness, compounded by his envy at Guts' progress, which causes him to lash out and escape the Falcon's encampment. The eclipse itself is an embodiment of Griffith's wrath because he chooses to cleanse his spirit of emotions by bathing himself in his comrade's blood. And that's the kind of anger that no religious text in this world will ever support. Things are going well for Griffith right now, so we can see why he's keeping his cool. You can rest assured that by the end of the series, they won't be. Guts and his friends will reverse the damage he's caused to the world, either by kidnapping his Moonlight Boy form or cutting down the world spiral tree with Skull Knight's sword, or maybe both, or something else entirely, which will be just as spectacular. When Griffith loses his kingdom a second time, for reasons that will be totally justified, he'll take on the form of the final dragon of this fantasy story. That's when Dragon Slayer will truly earn its name. But up until that day arrives, we'll have to content ourselves with the Tower of Rebirth interactions as being prime examples of his sinful wrath. Still, we hope that now you can see the full picture with regards to why we called Griffith a living embodiment of the 7 sins at the beginning of this video. He has, at multiple points in the story, committed one sin or another, and often multiple at the same time. He's a prideful and envious man who's greedy, lustful, and a glutton for one thing: power. His wrath created the world that Berserk's inhabitants live in right now. His wrath will have the power to unmake that world as well. Our best hope, our only hope, lies in a man who's just as broken as his sword was in the worst moment of his life. But as long as Guts can find a way to stand up with broken sword in hand once more, we have faith that Griffith and his sins will finally be purged from this world. Marvelous verdict! Having said that, we hope you enjoyed this video because we did go a little too deep into the specifics of Griffith's sins. We know that you guys expect such detailed accounts from us, and we're just glad you trust Marvelous Anime to be your source for all things Berserk related. As always, let us know your thoughts on Berserk's fallen Seraph and any of his sins we might have omitted down in the comments section below, and like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content. We'll see you guys real soon with another video, so until next time, stay safe and remember, keep on struggling, strugglers.